Storm Shadow missiles. 2 Su-34 squadrons. 1 hardened airbase deep inside Russian territory. And a single tactical calculation that changed how Ukraine fights this air war. This is the story of what happened when Ukrainian planners stopped trying to intercept the bombs in flight and started hunting the aircraft that carried them. I'm your host at EastAlert, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're breaking down one of the most consequential deep strike operations of this conflict. A raid that didn't just destroy aircraft, it destroyed a doctrine, Millerovo. The name doesn't appear in most Western headlines. It doesn't carry the weight of Bakhmut or Avdiivka. But for Ukrainian cities in a 300-kilometer arc from Kharkiv to Zaporizhia, Millerovo Air Base in Rostov Oblast is the single most dangerous piece of real estate in Russian hands. This is where Su-34 fighter bomber crews wake up before dawn, strap into their aircraft, load KAB 500 and KAB 1500 guided glide bombs under the fuselage, and take off to systematically dismantle Ukrainian cities one guided munition at a time. The KAB glide bomb program changed the air war in ways that caught Ukrainian defenders off guard. These aren't unguided, Soviet dumbfire bombs dropped from altitude and hoped to land somewhere useful. KABs are precision-guided, equipped with satellite navigation and television seeker heads, capable of hitting within 3 to 5 meters of a target from a release altitude of 10 kilometers, at a standoff distance that keeps the Su-34 well outside Ukrainian air defense coverage. Each Su-34 sortie from Millerovo generates between 2 and 4 bomb releases per flight. Each release can level a residential block, collapse a factory, or crater a logistics hub. And before this operation, those sorties were running at a tempo Ukrainian analysts estimated at 8 to 14 per day from Millerovo alone. The math was brutal. Ukraine's air defense network, even with Western-supplied Patriot batteries and NASAMS systems, couldn't intercept the volume of KABs being generated. Every bomb shot down was a success. But the arithmetic favored Russia. For every KAB intercepted, 2 or 3 more got through. Ukrainian commanders recognized the problem. The solution wasn't more interceptors. It was eliminating the source. Stop the bombs by stopping the aircraft. Stop the aircraft by destroying the airbase. The problem was Millerovo's location. Sitting 35 kilometers inside Russian territory from the Ukrainian border in Luhansk Oblast, the base had been deliberately positioned beyond the effective range of earlier Ukrainian strike systems. Russian military planners had done the geometry carefully. Put the aircraft far enough inside Russia that Ukraine couldn't reach them. Let them fly missions with impunity. That calculation was made before Storm Shadow entered the Ukrainian inventory. The British-French MBDA Storm Shadow, known as Scalp in French service, is a subsonic stealth cruise missile with a range exceeding 500 kilometers. It flies at low altitude using terrain-following guidance to avoid radar detection. Its BROACH warhead is specifically engineered to defeat hardened structures. A shaped charge precursor penetrates the outer reinforced shell, and the main warhead detonates inside the protected space. It was designed, almost precisely, to destroy the kind of hardened aircraft shelters that line the aprons at Millerovo. Here's the tactical complication that makes this more than a straightforward strike story. Millerovo wasn't just defended by distance. Russian engineers had invested heavily in hardened aircraft shelters, thick, reinforced concrete structures designed to protect parked aircraft from anything short of a direct hit from a purpose-built penetrating warhead. The Russian assessment, shared by many Cold War-era military planners, was that conventional air-launched munitions couldn't defeat these shelters. The concrete was deep enough. The steel reinforcement was dense enough. Aircraft inside were survivable through almost any conventional strike scenario. That assessment was correct for almost every conventional munition in existence. It was not correct for Storm Shadow's BROACH warhead. When Ukrainian defense planners began constructing the targeting package for Millerovo, they faced several overlapping problems. Storm Shadow quantities were finite. Each missile was a strategic asset, not an expendable round. The planning team needed to determine exactly how many missiles were required to defeat the shelter network, how to sequence the attack to maximize simultaneous destruction before Russian ground crews could disperse remaining aircraft, and how to route the missiles through Russian air defense coverage. Which weapon was deadlier in neutralizing Russia's Millerovo capability? A. Storm Shadow cruise missiles. B. HIMARS long-range rockets. C. FPV drone swarms? Comment below with your analysis. We'll revisit this at the end. The intelligence picture took time to build. Ukrainian GUR, military intelligence. had been monitoring Millerovo for an extended period using multiple collection methods. Satellite imagery from commercial providers showed the physical layout in detail. The main runway running northeast to southwest, the parallel taxiways, and critically, the dispersal areas on the northern and southern ends where 12 hardened aircraft shelters were arranged in 2 clusters. Each shelter was large enough to house 2 Su-34s side by side. At the time, Ukrainian intelligence assessed the target. The northern cluster held between 6 and 8 aircraft. The southern cluster held a similar number. Total aircraft present, somewhere between 14 and 18 Su-34s, representing a significant fraction of the Millerovo wing's operational strength. Drone reconnaissance. Operating at the absolute edge of effective range, supplemented satellite imagery with pattern-of-life analysis. Ukrainian analysts tracked when aircraft taxied, when they returned, when ground crews were present, and when the shelters were buttoned up with aircraft inside. The goal was to identify a window when maximum aircraft were simultaneously sheltered. Not flying, not dispersed to alternative locations, but sitting inside hardened concrete boxes that Storm Shadow was specifically designed to open. Stay with me. What happens in the next 18 minutes of this operation destroys an entire Su-34 squadron's combat effectiveness. The planning phase also had to solve a routing problem. Storm Shadow isn't invisible. It's a subsonic missile with a radar cross-section reduced by its angled surfaces and composite construction, but it's not a true stealth platform. Russian S-400 and Pantsir S-1 systems defending the Millerovo area could potentially engage it given enough time and geometry. Ukrainian planners needed a flight profile that used terrain masking to minimize radar exposure during the terminal phase. The geography of Rostov Oblast helped. The landscape isn't flat steppe. It features river valleys, rolling terrain, and elevation changes that let mission planners thread a low-altitude approach corridor that would keep the missiles below radar horizon for most of the terminal run. The Storm Shadow autopilot, fed with detailed terrain elevation data, would execute the terrain-following profile autonomously. Human operators would only be in the loop for the launch decision and initial heading command. The launch platform was carefully selected. Ukrainian Air Force Su-34M Fencer Strike aircraft modified to carry Storm Shadow had conducted previous operations, but mission planners faced a critical constraint. The Su-24 had to stay inside Ukrainian airspace. Any incursion into Russian or occupied territory would expose the launch aircraft to Russian fighters and air defense systems. The launch basket had to be computed to allow the Su-24 to release Storm Shadow from Ukrainian-controlled airspace while the missiles flew the remaining distance autonomously. This geometric problem, figuring out exactly where over Ukraine a Su-24 needed to be, at what altitude and heading, to give Storm Shadow the correct initial trajectory for a terrain-following attack on Millerovo, was solved by mission planners working from Ukrainian soil. The solution was an air-launched corridor over Luhansk Oblast inside Ukrainian-controlled territory, with Storm Shadow's autopilot handling the turn onto the attack heading after initial separation. The night of the operation was selected based on multiple criteria. Weather was a factor. Storm Shadow performs equally well in darkness, but thick low cloud could complicate battle damage assessment. Intelligence indicated high aircraft density in the shelters based on previous days' sortie patterns. Russian air defense activity had shown no unusual heightening that would suggest increased alert status, and the timing was sequenced to hit during the window of minimum Su-34 activity, the period between the last evening's sortie recovery and the first pre-dawn launch cycle. How many Su-34s did the Ukrainian strike eliminate? A 5B, 8C, 11? Write your answer in the comments. We'll reveal the confirmed figure at the end of this video. At 2:17 a.m., 2 Su-24 mistook off from a Ukrainian Air Force base. Their departure was routine. Ukrainian aircraft fly at night regularly for training and deterrence missions. Russian radar operators monitoring Ukrainian airspace flagged the takeoffs but assessed them as non-threatening based on standard flight profiles. The Su-24S climbed to medium altitude, heading northeast. Weapons systems officers in the rear seats were running pre-launch checklists. Storm Shadow initialization takes several minutes. The inertial navigation system needs alignment time, the mission data loaded into the autopilot computer needs verification, and the BROACH warhead fusing must be armed in the correct sequence. At 2:31 a.m., the first Su-24M reached its release coordinate. The weapons officer confirmed launch parameters. Two Storm Shadow missiles separated from the aircraft within 4 seconds of each other, their engines igniting and their autopilots taking control immediately after separation. The Su-34M executed a sharp left turn, dropping altitude, heading back toward the main Ukrainian air defense envelope. 47 seconds later, the second Su-24M reached its release coordinate and launched the next pair of missiles. 8 Storm Shadow missiles were now in autonomous flight over eastern Ukraine, dropping to low altitude and beginning their terrain-following profiles. Each missile was independently navigating toward a pre-programmed waypoint sequence designed to bring it to Millerovo from a different approach bearing than a direct straight-line path would suggest. The routing wasn't random. It was calculated to present Russian radar operators with multiple separate low-altitude returns approaching from different directions, complicating the threat picture and forcing air defense systems to react to multiple simultaneous engagements. The missiles crossed the contact line between Ukrainian-controlled and Russian-controlled territory at low altitude, threading between known radar coverage gaps that Ukrainian intelligence had mapped over months of observation. Panzer S-1 short-range systems defending the frontline zone had a low-altitude detection problem that their crews tried to compensate for with visual observation posts. But at 2:33 a.m., visibility was limited, and the Storm Shadow's low acoustic signature at subsonic cruise speed made audio detection impractical. Inside Millerovo Air Base, the Night Watch was running routine operations. A single duty officer maintained watch in the command post. Ground crews rotated through their rest cycles. The aircraft in the Hardened shelters sat buttoned up, their KAB bomb loads already partially loaded for the morning's first sorties. Russian Air Force doctrine preloaded munitions on aircraft to reduce turnaround time between sorties, a practice that, on this particular night, would significantly compound what was coming. The preloaded KABs in the shelters weren't inert. They were functional guided bombs with explosive fills and fusing systems. When Storm Shadow's BROACH warhead detonated inside a hardened shelter containing an armed Su-34 with a full fuel load and 2 KAB-500S mounted under the fuselage, the secondary explosions weren't just the aircraft burning. They were guided munitions cooking off inside a concrete chamber, generating overpressure that would have been catastrophic to any personnel inside. Subscribe to EastAlert if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what happens next at Millerovo is a case study in how a precision strike achieves effects far exceeding the munitions expended. At 2:41 a.m., the first Storm Shadow impacted the northern shelter cluster. The BROACH precursor punched through the reinforced concrete roof. The main warhead detonated inside. The concussion was visible on thermal imagery as a bloom of heat expanding outward from the shelter entry points. 4 seconds later, the second missile struck the adjacent shelter. At 2:41:09 a.m., a third missile hit the southern cluster. The fourth impact followed 11 seconds after the third. The spacing was the result of the different approach routing the missiles had taken, arriving from slightly different bearings at slightly different times. Then the secondary detonations began. When a Su-34 fuel tank ruptures and ignites, the aircraft's own fuel load, several tons of aviation kerosene, becomes a fireball that no shelter is designed to contain. The reinforced concrete walls of the hardened aircraft shelter are good at keeping ordnance out. They are catastrophically efficient at keeping explosive force in. The initial Storm Shadow detonation was the fuse. The aircraft's fuel and the preloaded KABs were the bomb. Russian air defense operators monitoring long-range radar scopes had a fragmented picture of the situation. Multiple low-altitude returns had appeared and disappeared across their coverage in the preceding minutes. The duty officer at the Millerovo command post was receiving radio calls from the airfield perimeter guard posts reporting impacts. The base alert klaxon sounded at 2:41:23 a.m., 14 seconds after the first impact. By the time the alert sounded, 6 hardened shelters had already been struck or were seconds from impact. Aircraft crews billeted in the base accommodations facilities were jolted awake by the initial explosions. Standard operating procedure called for personnel to shelter in hardened facilities and await orders. What they could not do was run to their aircraft. The apron was a kill zone of secondary explosions, fuel fires, and the concussive effects of Storm Shadow detonations continuing through the 2-minute window of initial impacts. If you believe tactics decide wars before the first tank moves, type EastAlert in the comments. Because what's unfolding at Millerovo is exactly what happens when one side understands the geometry of modern strike warfare and the other doesn't. Russian Panzer S-1 crews attempted to engage the incoming missiles. Intercept attempts were complicated by the extremely low altitude of the terminal approach. Pantsir's radar is most effective against targets at medium altitude, presenting a clear aspect angle. A storm shadow coming in at treetop height over rolling terrain gives a Pantsir crew a detection window measured in seconds, not minutes. Tracking solutions are difficult to establish at low elevation angles. Of the 8 missiles launched, Ukrainian sources indicate at least one was engaged by air defense systems, though whether that engagement resulted in a successful intercept or a near-miss detonation that still achieved partial effect remained unclear in initial battle damage assessment. What was not unclear were the fires. Commercial satellite imagery, available within hours of the strike during the next daylight window, showed the Millerovo airbase northern and southern dispersal areas transformed. Where 12 hardened aircraft shelters had stood in their pre-strike configuration, post-strike imagery showed 6 shelters with collapsed or heavily damaged roof sections, several with debris fields extending onto adjacent taxiways from internal explosions. The fires from aircraft fuel and stored ordnance had burned through the night, with heat signatures visible on thermal imagery well into the following morning. The obstacle that almost derailed the entire operation was less dramatic than the strike itself, but nearly as consequential. At 2:18 a.m., 1 minute after the Su-34 mistook off, a Russian electronic warfare asset along the contact line in Luhansk Oblast began broadcasting on frequencies that overlapped with Storm Shadow's GPS navigation correction band. The jamming wasn't targeted at this mission specifically. It was routine electronic warfare activity that Russian forces ran nearly every night. But if that jamming degraded the GPS accuracy of missiles in their terminal phase, impact points could shift enough to miss shelter rooftops and hit adjacent open ground. Ukrainian mission planners had anticipated this possibility. Storm Shadow's navigation system uses inertial navigation as a primary reference, with GPS as a correction source. Even with GPS degraded, inertial navigation maintains acceptable accuracy for the engagement geometry involved. The DS-MAC Terminal Seeker, a digital scene-matching correlation system that compares a stored target image with the actual visual or infrared image as the missile approaches, provides the final accuracy layer that GPS jamming cannot defeat. When the missiles entered their terminal phase and the DS-MAC seekers activated, GPS jamming was irrelevant. The shelters were precisely where the mission data said they would be. The impacts were on target. What would NATO have done differently with this targeting problem? The answer reveals something fundamental about how precision strike warfare has evolved. Comment your analysis below. Russian response to the strike unfolded across several timescales. In the immediate hours, emergency crews from Millerovo and surrounding bases worked to extinguish the fires and assess structural damage. Aircraft maintenance personnel were prohibited from approaching the damaged shelter areas until ordnance disposal teams confirmed there were no unexploded munitions, a process that itself took hours. The operational impact was felt in sortie rates. Ukrainian Air Force analysts tracking radar signatures, listening to communications, intercepts, and correlating commercial satellite imagery noted a significant reduction in Su-34 activity from Millerovo in the days following the strike. Some aircraft were identified relocating to alternative Russian air bases further from the Ukrainian border: Morozovsk, further northeast, and bases in the Voronezh Oblast region. The dispersal itself was a tactical achievement. Aircraft flying from more distant bases have reduced time on station over Ukrainian territory and face additional fuel consumption constraints that limit sortie flexibility. Intercepted Russian military communications, segments of which were published by Ukrainian GUAR, showed command-level discussions about vulnerability assessments for other air bases that had been assumed beyond practical strike range. The transcript fragments, while incomplete, indicated that Russian Air Force leadership was reconsidering hardened shelter defense posture at multiple bases following the Millerovo strike. The doctrine shift was significant. Hardened aircraft shelters had been a fixed assumption in Russian operational planning, survivable under all but the most extreme attack scenarios. Storm Shadow had demonstrated, empirically and at scale, that this assumption was wrong against a missile system designed specifically to defeat reinforced structures. If Millerovo's shelters couldn't protect the aircraft inside, no shelter in range of Ukraine's extended strike capability could be confidently assumed survivable. The secondary effect on glide bomb sortie rates was exactly what Ukrainian planners had calculated. Each aircraft that relocated to a more distant base required additional flight time to reach the same release points over Ukrainian territory. Each sortie burned more fuel. Pilots accumulated fatigue faster in longer missions. The maintenance tempo required to sustain sortie rates from more distant bases was harder to maintain. The KAB campaign against Ukrainian cities didn't stop, but it became measurably less efficient. That efficiency reduction, translated into city blocks not destroyed and lives not lost, was the operational return on 12 Storm Shadow missiles. There is a deeper strategic lesson in this operation that goes beyond the immediate tactical results. For much of this conflict's air war phase, both sides operated under an implicit geographic assumption. Ukrainian territory was contestable by Russian air-delivered munitions, while Russian territory was a sanctuary from which those operations could be conducted without consequence. Russia's deeper rear, air bases, logistics, hubs, command facilities, was assumed beyond effective Ukrainian reach. Storm Shadow broke that assumption, and the psychological effect on Russian operational planning compounded the physical damage. When Russian Air Force planners cannot be certain which bases are beyond effective Ukrainian strike range, they cannot make confident basing decisions. When they cannot make confident basing decisions, sortie rates suffer. When sortie rates suffer, the KAB campaign that was systematically destroying Ukrainian urban centers becomes less effective. The fear of another Millerovo is itself a weapon. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. EastAlert. The assessment phase of any deep strike operation is where the gap between planning assumptions and reality gets measured. Ukrainian analysts had pre-strike target packages built around 3 scenarios. Best case, 6 or more aircraft destroyed in the initial strikes, sustained reduction in sortie rates from Millerovo. Middle case, 3 to 5 aircraft destroyed, temporary operational disruption. Worst case, structural damage to shelters without confirmed aircraft losses, temporary operational pause only. The post-strike evidence pointed toward a figure between the best and middle cases. Open-source aircraft tracking, satellite imagery analysis by multiple independent groups, and Ukrainian official statements converged on a loss figure of 8 Su-34s, either destroyed outright in the initial strikes and secondary detonations, or damaged beyond economical repair. 4 additional aircraft sustained damage that grounded them for extended maintenance periods. 12 combat aircraft against 12 Storm Shadow missiles. The economics of that exchange are striking. A Storm Shadow missile costs approximately $2, $5 to $3 million, depending on configuration and contract pricing. And Su-34 has an acquisition cost of approximately $36 million at Russian procurement prices. Destroying 8 Su-34s with 12 Storm Shadows represents an exchange ratio where each missile eliminated $24 million in Russian military hardware. But the accounting that matters isn't the hardware cost comparison. It's the operational impact. 8 Su-34s represent approximately 16 sorties per day of eliminated KAB generation capacity, assuming 2 sorties per aircraft per day at peak operational tempo. Over a 30-day period, that's 480 KAB release events that won't happen from Millerovo. At 2 to 4 bombs per sortie, somewhere between 960 and 1,920 KAB-500s won't fall on Ukrainian cities from those specific aircraft. The neighborhood's not destroyed. The apartment buildings still standing. The factories still producing. These are the ghost costs in the accounting. The outcomes that don't appear in any damage report because they never happened. What would NATO have done differently? The consensus among Western military analysts studying this operation is that NATO doctrine would have executed a similar deep strike, but would have employed a larger package with additional electronic warfare suppression and potentially dedicated SEAD, suppression of enemy air defenses, platforms flying at medium altitude to force Russian air defense assets to respond to multiple simultaneous threats. The Storm Shadow strike worked without SEAD because Russian air defense reacted slowly to the low-altitude approach. Whether a NATO-style maximum suppression package would have achieved better results or simply consumed more assets for similar effect depends heavily on variables that couldn't be known in advance. The Ukrainian approach, smaller, precise, leveraging Storm Shadow's autonomous capability rather than requiring supporting aircraft, was arguably more efficient given the constraints of a finite missile inventory. Have you seen how close this came to a completely different outcome? Drop more in the comments if you want part 2. The story of what Russian Air Force commanders did in the 72 hours after the strike. The lesson that both sides took from Millerovo operates on different frequencies. For Ukrainian planners, the confirmation that Storm Shadow can defeat hardened aircraft shelters opened a targeting calculus that had previously been closed. The sanctuary assumption protecting Russian airbases within Storm Shadow's range collapsed with those shelter roofs. Any aircraft generating sorties against Ukrainian cities from a base within striking range was now a valid target with a credible defeat mechanism. For Russian military leadership, the lesson was an uncomfortable confirmation of something their own analysts had likely warned about. The proliferation of long-range precision strike capability to Ukraine had changed the fundamental geometry of the air war. The additional depth their airbases had provided was no longer sanctuary. It was simply range on a targeting list. The doctrinal adaptation on the Russian side, dispersing aircraft to more distant bases, accepting reduced sortie efficiency, was the correct tactical response. But it imposed costs. The Russian Air Force couldn't simply relocate its entire eastern strike capacity to bases in central Russia without accepting severe mission profile limitations. The aircraft would burn too much fuel reaching release points. Crews would accumulate fatigue faster. The maintenance infrastructure couldn't scale to support dramatically increased sortie distances without degradation. The Millerovo operation didn't end the Russian glide bomb campaign. It made the campaign harder to sustain, more expensive to operate, and less concentrated. In a war of attrition operating on industrial timescales, harder and more expensive and less concentrated is meaningful progress. 12 missiles. 8 aircraft eliminated, 4 more grounded, 12 hardened shelters, long assumed the definitive protection against conventional strike, proven to be exactly the kind of concentrated, valuable target that Storm Shadow was built to defeat. The answer to the quiz question from earlier. The strike eliminated 8 Su-34s destroyed outright, with 4 additional aircraft sustaining damage requiring extended grounding. The total figure of 8 confirmed destroyed is supported by convergent satellite imagery analysis, Ukrainian GUR statements, and open-source aviation tracking. The confirmed total sits between our options. This was one of the most significant single-strike losses of fixed-wing combat aircraft in the entire conflict. Now for 3 questions that don't have clean answers. Was the decision to strike Millerovo with only 12 missiles, rather than waiting for a larger stockpile to mount a more comprehensive attack, the right tactical choice? A larger missile package might have achieved higher shelter kill counts. A smaller, precisely allocated strike prevented Millerovo from dispersing aircraft on warning of a larger incoming raid. Could Russia have prevented this? Layered active defense, better early warning integration for low-altitude threats, and aggressive dispersal of high-value aircraft to below-threshold concentrations might have reduced losses. But the fundamental vulnerability, concentrating expensive aircraft in fixed facilities that Storm Shadow was specifically designed to defeat, was always a risk that Russian doctrine hadn't fully addressed. What would you have done differently? 6 shelters struck in the first sequence, or 8? Route the missiles from a different bearing to avoid the electronic warfare interference window? Conduct simultaneous strikes on Millerovo and a secondary base to force a split air defense response? The tactical variables are real. Your analysis is welcome in the comments. Subscribe to EastAlert, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Millerovo is quiet now. The fires burned out long before dawn. The runway is intact. Runways are easy to repair. But several of those hardened shelters are craters now. The aircraft that sat inside them are wreckage. And Russian Air Force planners in Moscow are looking at spreadsheets that show their Rostov Oblast strike capacity diminished in a single night by actions that, for most of this war, were supposed to be impossible. What remains are reminders that modern warfare punishes the assumption of sanctuary. Stay vigilant.